Welcome to lesson 6. Today's lesson will be about efficient note taking. So first of all, I will provide some tips for taking notes. Secondly, I will talk about how to draw proper conclusions from the showdowns you see from your opponents. Thirdly, I'll share some of my thoughts on how to better understand your opponent's psychology and how to adjust your strategy accordingly. And of course, I'll provide a ton of examples to illustrate what I'm trying to say. So, what are some tips for taking notes? I think it's generally a very good idea just to focus on general tendencies. So I don't really want to write something too complex. We just want to write some stuff about the general mindset of the player, certain moves he can pull off, some bet sizing or timing tells. So maybe he takes really long to tank when he has the nuts. So if you picked up on that, you want to write that into your notes. Some people just bet really big or really small with a lot of bluffs or with a lot of value hands. So such stuff can be noted down. Ability to make moves in rare spots. I think this is also pretty important. There are certain spots whereby people rarely bluff, so if they do bluff in such a spot, then you just write it down because it's very noteworthy. And yes, as mentioned earlier, just focus on trying to understand the general player mentality. So if he is capable of making mega huge bluffs, he's probably really aggressive. If he has like a nitty mentality, then you might want to write that down. Especially if you see him unable to value bet very thinly in a spot where he should probably be doing so. Another tip that's really important is to avoid writing hand histories, because what you'll find is that it's really difficult to read, especially if you are playing multiple tables. Back in the day, I was playing like 6 to 8 Zoom tables. That's the equivalent of 20 tables. And I just found myself having absolutely no time to read my notes. So I could only read the very basic stuff I wrote down. But if I wrote a lot of hand histories, I probably wouldn't have enough time to read everything. So if I had a note something, if I noted down something like turns made hands into bluffs, capable of running a suicidal bluff whereby he reps very little, then if a similar spot occurs, I can much more quickly process the information and put it to use. So I guess the more tables you're playing, the shorter you want your notes to be. And also, I would highly recommend not repeating what you would see in a HUD. So if someone 3-bets a lot and your HUD is displaying that his 3-bet stat is like 15%, I don't really think you need to write that down. Unless of course he chooses weird hands to 3-bet with, like maybe 7-4 offsuit, then perhaps you might want to write that down because that's more interesting. That allows you to know that he's probably 3-betting on a whim and he doesn't really have a fixed game plan. Okay, so next we have some short form for various words. So I think in general people use X for check, B for bet, C for call, and I guess capital F, capital T, and capital R for the flop, the turn, and the river. So for example, if you want to indicate that someone is double barreling, you can just write BBX, which indicates he bets the flop, bets the turn, and bets the river, checks the river. I guess you can write BFBTXR, but BBX is just a lot shorter and it obviously states that he's just bet checking. And XBX means that the opponent is just going for a delayed turn bet. So here are some other short forms for various phrases. So when someone turns a weak mate hand into a bluff, so a lot of lower level players aren't capable of these move. So if a fish does it, I would probably just write it down. Like sometimes people have a pair, like a middle pair hand, and when the flush completes, they might just turn it into a bluff after facing a check twice. So I think that's pretty interesting to note. So I'll just write it as WMV. You can write something else, but I used to write TWMHIV, but that's a bit too long, so I just shorten it to WNB. UBB under bet bluff. So if someone uses a very small bet as a bluff, I will just write it down. I feel like at lower limits, people usually are having way too many value hands when they bet 1/3 the pot. OBB, over bets bluff. So I think over betting, some people tend to have way too much bluffs and some people tend to have too much value. So every time you see an over bet, maybe you just write OBB. Then if you see it 5 times and all of them are bluffs, you can just write like ×5. So yeah, I think the weaker the opponent is, the greater the imbalances in his range will be. OBV, over bet value. DB, donk bet. I guess I like to write DDD for like donking 3 streets, which is the line which some fishers like to use. Okay, so I guess that's all. So let's move on and talk about some examples here. So we want to think about what information we are actually getting when we see the showdown. Okay, so let's just assume that we are not one of these two players. We are not MP and we are not button. Let's say we are just sitting at the table and it gets to showdown. We get to see both players' hands. So what would you learn as a passive observer here? So MP opens with 8-7. The button calls with pocket 10s. So it's heads up. MP bets the flop, which is, I think, fairly standard. The board favors the pre-flop raiser. He has some backdoor draws. Button calls, which I also feel is pretty standard. So calling 10s plus is very standard. Maybe you might even call 9s, but I probably wouldn't go much weaker than that. The turn goes check, check. Okay, so first of all, MP didn't barrel with his gut shot, which I guess is fine. It's not like the most interesting piece of information in the world. Maybe he's just a bit more passive when it comes to barreling. I would often barrel here, but I mean, sometimes I give up as well. The button checks back, which is also very standard. Okay, so what's interesting is the river. So the hero chose to check for his hand, chose to check his hand, and the button opted to turn his hand into a bluff by betting here, which I think is not really a good play. I might turn my hand into a bluff on a queen or a jack, but I think pocket 10s has enough showdown on the value here. And the hero opted to check raise bluff here, which I feel like is a spot where he cannot really represent too much here. He is kind of representing pocket aces, which would often check the flop, pocket 7s, which may or may not bet the flop, probably checks the turn and may bet the river. I think most of the time pocket 7s doesn't really check raise this river. This is not necessarily a spot where the button takes this line very often, whereby he calls flop, checks turn and bets the river very often. I think he can be expected to check back on the river very often, so I think it's not a good spot for MP to go for a check raise with too many hands. And after getting raised, he calls, so that's another useful piece of information. Okay, so what would I write about the MP player? Firstly, he's capable of turning weak mate hands into bluffs, because he did have a third pair, right? But he turned it into a check raise. So he bluffs with strange lines, so I think bet check check raise is kind of a weird line as the preflop raiser, so I would note that down as well. And the button isn't really thinking properly, he's just randomly clicking buttons, so I just write that his random betting. And he also turned pocket tens into a bluff, which clearly highlights that he doesn't really understand why he's calling the flop with pocket tens, which is actually to showdown and not to bluff. Because the board didn't change significantly in any way, so he should just check it down. Okay, so what are some of my future exploits against MP? So given that we know he's capable of turning like some third pair into a bluff, I'll be prepared to call down more often when draws complete. I feel like this guy will often just turn a draw into a weak pair into a bluff. If let's say I feel like this guy also likes to pounce on weakness, so you might want to consider putting in some block bets and call it off against him. I guess it's not exactly the same spot, but it's just that based on the hand history here, I think we have a pretty good idea of his general mentality. He's just randomly getting aggressive without really considering what he can represent here. Okay, versus the button, less hero calling with ace high. So I think in spots whereby a lot of the draws missed, I am not going to be hero calling as often. I feel like this guy might be capable of betting third pair, fourth pair, just calling flop and then just betting the river. So the relative hand strength of your bluff catchers goes down, because when he's betting with like bottom pair or middle pair, it makes it such that his range for betting isn't polarized. So having ace high to hero call is good against polarized ranges, but when your opponent could be bluffing with a hand better than yours, then you should probably not bluff catch. Example 2. Okay, so Cutoff raises the small blind and the big blind calls. So the small blind isn't important here, but it's three-way. The Cutoff bets the flop, which is standard. The big blind raises, which I guess is fine, yeah. The small blind calls. So first important thing to note, the big blind bets the turn, because this is a spot where many players would check the turn with a set. But this guy opted to bet the turn. Secondly, he opted to use a half pot bet. Is that very significant? I don't really think so, because both players will have $6 left behind. The pot has 8 already. So I think the half pot bet doesn't mean anything, but the betting action does tell the story that the big blind is betting a set here. On the river, the big blind chose not to shove here. So when he bets slightly under half pot in a spot where there's more than a half pot, less than a pot size bet left, it might indicate that he is likelier to be more value heavy. Maybe he's scared of the queen, but I mean, he improved to a full house, right? Does he really think that hero has king queen all the time? I don't really think so. Okay, so what have we learned about the big blind? So I think the Cutoff played it very standard. On a pairing card, you don't really want to raise with a 10 high draw. So there's really nothing that we learned about the Cutoff. But for the big blind, we know that after check raising the flop, he will still barrel the turn with a set. So I wrote here bet smallish even with strong hands, but I think after looking at the set to pot ratio again, I think like that's not really a small bet, that's just a standard bet, and he can just shove the river for $6. So what are some of my adjustments here? Versus the big blind, I might consider jamming some flushes on the turn, especially hands like what we see here from the Cutoff. So if we jam here, he has to cost $6 more and a pot of 20. Yeah, that's about 20. So he's getting about 29-30% pot odds, and with a set he's getting 20% equity. So there's room for the opponent to make a bad bet call on the turn. So yeah, I think it could be a good spot to shove some of the more vulnerable draws. So also, since we know that he is probably using that under half pot bet on the river with value hands, we might want to consider folding more often next time. Example 3. The big blind calls with ace 9 against a button 2.5x raise. The big blind check calls flop, check calls turn, which is both very standard. And he goes for a check raise on the river. So let's imagine we were the button and we called and we saw our opponent's hand. So what would we have learned about the big blind? First of all, he's capable of turning weak mate hands into bluffs, especially with the blocker. So I'll just write NFB, nut flush blocker, against a bet line, triple barrel. So he's capable of turning a weak mate hand into a bluff, especially when the backdoor flush completes. So I feel that's pretty interesting. So next time, if I triple barrel a set or a straight in this spot, I'll be a lot more inclined to call down. Although this is actually a spot where people tend to have like 7, 8 of diamonds, 9x of diamonds really often. It's not a spot where people bluff too often, so I think you should consider hero folding against many people, but against this guy I would be more inclined not to fold next time. Versus the big blind. So I think we should be more willing to bet call the river lighter in spots where people are less inclined to bluff, because when the backdoor flush completes, I think the pre-flop raiser just has way more flush combinations as compared to the pre-flop caller. So it's just a spot where people don't bluff very often. Okay, example 4. The hijack opens with pocket kings. So he bets the flop, check calls the turn, and check calls the river. I think all 3 plays are pretty interesting. So let's talk about what we learned about the hijack here. So first of all, I think he's betting medium strength hands on the board. I guess kings generally plays better as a check here. Kings play better, I think. Queens and jacks. I guess jacks to kings kind of play the same, as in they have a similar relative hand strength, but pocket kings is just more vulnerable, less vulnerable than jacks here. So I probably bet jacks more often here, and I check kings more often. So he did choose to bet the flop, which, you know, it's not the biggest deal, but I feel like this guy is capable of betting second pairs. I guess it helps that there are already 2 aces. So if he did bet kings here, if on an ace 9-5 board, then I would be more, I think that would be more noteworthy. He check calls the turn. Yeah, so I guess with the king of spade, that's alright. Although when you check call here, you are really not beating much, to be honest. What do you actually beat here? You beat like pocket 10s turn into a bluff. I think pocket 8s would fold the flop. You beat like 9, 10. And a lot of those hands would just check back on the turn, especially if the guy is more of a straightforward player. And on the river, if you check call pocket kings again, I feel like that's a bit too loose. You can call with like ace-x and fold queens and kings. I think that would probably be a better option. So this guy is probably a big station. So I guess the cutoff had pretty loose stats of like 52, 42, but still it just feels like a really loose call down. And I think the cutoff can't really have too many bluffing hands here. So I think MP is just a station by nature. What are my adjustments after looking at that showdown? First of all, I might be more inclined to raise the flop wider. I feel like The hijack is just betting too much with medium strength hands. I would also value bet lighter against him, and I would avoid turning a hand like 9x into a bluff against him, because he is just never. For example, on the ace 9 board, if I have 10-9 on this texture, I think it could be a decent play to turn it into a bluff, right? Because if you never turn a 9 into a bluff sometimes here, it means that your betting range is only like trip aces or better, which allows your opponent to fold kings and queens on the turn right away. However, this guy is just not folding a better hand. Like, he's probably calling down tens to kings, maybe. I guess he might fold without the spade, but it feels like this guy is too loose, so I would probably avoid turning like 10-9 into a bluff on the turn and the river. Example 5. MP raises with ace king to 3 big blinds. The small blind calls, and the small blind leads the flop and leads the turn. So I guess usually when we talk about online play, we don't really get to see the showdown, but in live play sometimes they like to open mark their hands and let people know what they are folding with. So if, let's say, MP throws open his hand and tells people he's folding ace king here, then what would we learn about him? So I think in general, he just has a weak tight or a nitty mentality. So my adjustment against him is to take strange lines with bluffs just to confuse him. So this guy is just not very accustomed to donk bets, and even though ace king is a super clear call here, he just made a really weak fold. So I might consider donking into him. I might do some random check raise or over bets, and he's just going to fold really often. So yeah, we can tell that when this guy is confused, he just opts for the weak tight play, which is to fold. Example 6. Under the gun opens, he check calls flop, check calls the turn, which I feel is very standard for queen here. And he also check called on the ace river, which I don't think is a very good play. Ace queen got there. I guess not many people bet ace queen here. They usually check back. Although if they felt you never had trips, then ace queen could be a triple barrel. You would also lose to queen 10 suited. I guess under the gun has 2 queens. You lose to ace x of diamonds. Yeah, so the only hands you are really beating here is like 10-9 or like 7-6 of diamonds. So I think this call down is way too loose. So we know that under the gun player is just a station, and he just calls really light against half pot bets. So I would continue using half pot bets for thin value against him and value bet really thinly. I'm not sure how light he calls down against larger bets, but I think this works. Versus under the gun, I'm going to be using more thin value betting, less bluffs, and I will bluff with a bigger sizing as an exploit, perhaps. I'm not sure if it works. Maybe he's just a station against larger sizings as well. But if I wanted to bluff, I will make sure to use a larger sizing. Example 7. Small blind opens. The big blind calls with Jack 9. So he calls the flop, which I feel is standard. The small blind fires a second time, and he raises the turn. And he bets the river. So what have we learnt about this player? So he did turn 2 pair on a board with a possible straight, queen 10, 16 combinations of that. And he also loses to like plenty of maybe 15 to 20 combos of flushes, depending on how wide the small blind is opening, maybe even 30 to 40 combos. So I think he just overvalues 2 pairs here. That's the main reason. So this guy doesn't really know how to understand relative hand strength properly. He just looks at his absolute hand strength and plays his hand accordingly. So my adjustment here against him is that on 3 straight and 3 flush turns, I would just assign him a wider value range. Of course, I will just fold more with 1 pair hands, and I will be more willing to sack off lighter with sets and top 2. So, not saying you should, but like, if he bets small enough and you're getting the right odds, perhaps you have to call down. So, like, let's say if we have a similar board texture here, against some guys, you could consider just bet folding the straight here. But here, I'm never bet folding a straight. I'm definitely calling down with a set as well. Example 8. So the button calls twice with ace queen, and he checks the river. So some of you might think this is fairly standard, but let's think about this spot again. Do we actually have value here with ace queen in the button's shoes? So I feel like when all the draws missed, I expect most standard MP players to fire 3 streets with a hand like 2 pairs plus. When the button doesn't raise the turn, I feel like he rarely has a set. I think sets would usually raise, especially against a smaller turn bet. So MP should be pretty confident even if he has a hand like ace 6, ace 8. He should be able to bet the river against ace jack, ace queen, and maybe like ace 9 suited, ace 5 suited. When 2 flush draws miss, people just call a lot lighter here. So when MP checks here, I think he's capped at ace queen. So when you think your opponent is capped at ace queen, I feel like the button can just value bet half pot here. So we just know that the button probably doesn't know how to value bet thinly here. So when he bets next time, we know he is having a narrower value range. So yeah, just adjust your strategy accordingly with this new piece of information. Example 9. So let's say that hero opens to 3 big blinds, the button calls. So MP is the player with pocket queens. He bets the flop, bets the turn, bets the river, gets raised, and still pays off. So what have we learned about him? So it's pretty simple. He just tends to overplay his hands a lot, and you can just write down as well that he overplays a 1 card second nut flush on a paired board. My adjustment against him is to avoid bluffing him as much. And yeah, you can probably call down a bit lighter in some spots with certain hands, and with weaker bluff catching hands, you want to avoid doing hero calls. So I would expand my standard call down value range to some extent, but I would avoid making hero calls against someone who is not so polarized. Example 10. So the cutoff opens with queen 10 of hearts. He faces a 3-bet from the button and he 4-bets here. He bets the flop like 70% of the pot. I feel like this is really large for a 4-bet pot, especially when there is already like 40 big blinds. Is it 40 big blinds? Yeah, 40 big blinds in the pot already. And then he just jams the turn. So first of all, we know his sizing isn't very good because he's only left with a half pot bet on the turn. He can probably just bet half pot at the very least. And yeah, he will have 19 and he can shove it into a pot of 20, which feels a lot more. No, he could bet like 15 into a pot of 20. I feel that would be more reasonable. So what have we learnt about this player? He 4-bet bluffs with suited broadways. So I'm not going to put him on less ace-x hands in the future. I'll put him more on hands with good playability. So I will be assuming that he has many more flush draws in his range as compared to other players Also, I think his huge flop sizing could be an indication that he has the intention to jam the turn. So I would look out for that. My adjustment against this player is that I would just be putting him on more flush draws and 4-bet pots. So if I were putting him on a draw, I can just like call the flop and then call every single turn, right? Because if we think he has a draw very often, then on a blank turn, our second pair is actually doing pretty well. Example 11. So here's an example from Poker Strategy. The cutoff raises, the button 3 bets, and he 4 bets. So this is kind of similar to the previous hand, whereby both players are using strong hands which can actually call for 3 bets really well to add into their 4-bet bluffing range. But in this case, we are playing for close to 200 big blinds, so I feel this is probably a better play as compared to the previous play. Just now we only had 100 big blinds, which I think should speak for calling Queen 10 suited more often. This guy bets really large on the flop as well, and he pot jams the turn. So yes, there isn't a showdown, but let's say that somehow the cutoff reveals his hand. Either they get the showdown or he just opens his hand for image building purposes. So what would we have learnt about him? So once again, we know that he is 4-bet bluffing suited broadways or suited aces. His flop sizing is way too large, so we know he's not good at sizing his bets. Larger bet size might indicate he's on a draw, and he shoves the turn with a gut shot on a two-tone texture. So that indicates that his betting range is just too bluff heavy on such turns. My adjustment against this player is to never fold second pair on a two-tone texture, regardless of whether it's a single raise pot, a 3-bet pot, or a 4-bet pot. I feel like this guy's just bluffing way too much, so very very clear call with all second pair hands. Example 12. MP opens with ace king off. He bets the flop, he bets the turn, and he bets the river. So it's interesting to note that this is three-way, so betting thrice, especially with such a large sizing on the river. There's a very good chance he's overplaying here. I'm not sure how the button is playing, but it's very possible. He gets raised on the river and he still pays off, and I feel like button showed Queen Jack, which I feel like should be expected. Queen Jack plays like that. Queen Jack picked up the double gut shot on the turn, so Queen Jack is definitely not folding. Other than that, I guess he could occasionally raise the river with some 2 pairs, which may or may not be good. We know that MP barrels extremely thinly and he uses very large bet sizes, so he overplays top pair top kicker, and he also doesn't respect river raises in spots whereby the opponent can't really be bluffing, right? Think about it here. What could the button be bluffing with here? 10x of hearts turned into a bluff? I think an ace probably wouldn't bluff raise the river. King queen of hearts, king jack of hearts. That's about it. I think queen jack is a clear double call. Yeah, so we're not really beating that much. Our opponent has to turn many weak made hands into bluffs. So I would just raise rivers thinner for value in the future against this guy, right? If he's paying us off with ace king, he probably pays us off with ace queen pretty often as well. Maybe ace king is his cutoff point, I'm not sure. But I think with ace 10 or ace 9 here, it's probably good enough for raising. Because ace 9 beats ace 8, ace deuce, beats ace king as well, loses the queen jack. But from the hijack, he shouldn't have queen jack off. So I think this could be a good spot to raise ace 9 here against this guy. Okay, so this brings us to the end of the lesson. So I hope you guys learned something this time. Let me know if you have any questions, and see you in the next video. So Bye.